Okay, so the question we have right now is why are we stretching something that is perceived to be unstable or perceived to be lax? Now, there's two thought processes behind this. I'm going to give you the traditional one that the science is not bearing out. So it really is kind of a myth in most cases. And then I'm going to give you more of the evidence-based iteration or version of that. And then finally, we'll look at things in the big picture sense because sometimes there's a mix between the old hypothesis and the new hypothesis, and it does affect your care. So let's go over the old hypothesis first. So we're going to use the wrist. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit here. And I'm going to turn it just slightly and we'll recenter. From here, I'm going to mark it up. So the thought process with the wrist and there being a normal amount of tightness or ligamentous stability, capsular stability, is that on one side of the joint, I've got some nice structures that stabilize the joint. On the other, I have the reciprocal. I've got the same thing on the opposite side. It allows normal movement. It keeps the joint well aligned. Now, in the case of certain types of instability, that's no longer the case. So we'll get rid of that. We'll go back to markup. It can be where one side is now very lax. So there's a lot of movement. And the thought process is by having a lot of movement, the bones of the joint start to shift towards that area of laxity, which means on the opposite side, those previously normal ligaments are now going to be stiffer because they're shortened. There's not as much kind of push out from the joint that it's crossing anymore. Now, this is all theory, and most of that theory has not panned out whatsoever. But what we saw historically is that if we did treatments that push that joint towards the opposite direction of where we perceive laxity, for whatever reason, that made things get better. Well, as we continued to look at the nervous system and how it regards pain or how it treats pain, we start to notice that there's another larger system that we have to keep in mind, and that's the nervous system. So in this case, you don't really have to deal with stretching of the nerves, laxity of the nerves, or anything like that. What we see is in the wrist, if I have something going on in the wrist and I go into extension and something gets irritated, typically that's assessed by way of nerves, what are called mechanoreceptors, sense a signal, send it up to the brain perceives that that is pain. It will stop you from doing that because it's a bad movement. So when we do those joint mobilizations where I push on the wrist, or we do some of the stretches where you're creating a little bit of tension in the system and then going to your full end range of the stretch without pain, the theory here is that we're changing the way that that signal is sent from the wrist up to the brain and how it is perceived by the brain as either pain or not. That's the new theory, and that helps out with most conditions. Now, I told you there's kind of this little disconnect, or there's communication between those two systems. Sometimes the laxity or ligamentous instability of the wrist is enough that will result in a dislocation of one of the bones in the joints, one of the bones in that series of joints are the carpals, so that little clustering of bones. When that happens, you actually are getting a firm block. That bone is in the way. Sometimes that will respond to the treatments, sometimes it won't. At which point you go from ideally conservative care with some sort of medical intervention, be it injections or whatnot to help decrease the irritability. And finally, if it is one of those really unstable bony blocks that's stopping you from going anywhere, then that's the time where you start to consider surgical parameters. Now, if you're starting to get full range of motion and things are feeling better, then you start to think that this is more of the nervous system that we're working with, as opposed to there being a true bony block that needs to have some sort of surgical intervention. You may or may not, unfortunately with this condition, sometimes go to two directions. You get full range of motion, but it still hurts for whatever reason. In that case, then there's two things you can think of. One is possibly doing a surgical consult or changing the way that you move. That is a very personal judgment that's between you, yourself, and those health practitioners that are giving you good information in order to make the right determination for you as to what to do. So I hope this helps with understanding instability both the old thought process, the current thought process, and that melding of the two. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.